Imagine for a second that you are the President of the United States. It's October 27th, 1962, the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis. You're sitting in the Oval Office, and the phone rings. Your military commanders are on the line. A Soviet surface-to-air missile has just shot down an American U-2 spy plane over Cuba. The pilot is dead. Your Joint Chiefs of Staff are screaming for immediate retaliation. They want to bomb the missile sites. They want to invade Cuba within 48 hours. And they remind you for the 100th time this week that Soviet nuclear missiles 90 miles from Florida can obliterate American cities in less than 5 minutes. You have advisors telling you that if you don't strike first, you're weak. You have intelligence reports saying Nikita Khrushchev is bluffing, but also reports saying he's not. You've been told that a full nuclear war would kill a third of humanity. Most of those deaths would be concentrated in the United States, the Soviet Union, Europe and China. And the decision has to be made right now, not tomorrow, not in an hour. Now, this was the closest the world ever came to nuclear annihilation. But here's the thing that nobody talks about. We didn't blow ourselves up. Not in 1962. Not in 1983 when Soviet early warning systems falsely detected American missiles. Not during the 45 years of the Cold War when the United States and Soviet Union collectively built over 125,000 nuclear warheads. At the peak in 1986, there were more than 70,000 active nuclear weapons ready to launch. Enough to destroy civilization multiple times over. Today, we're going to dissect the one strategy that actually worked. Not the strategy military planners wanted. Not the strategy that sounded tough on the campaign trail. But the strategy that kept two nuclear superpowers from vaporizing each other for nearly half a century. The strategy with the darkly ironic acronym MAD. Mutually Assured Destruction. Buckle up. This is the story of how we survived the most dangerous game humanity has ever played. 1. The logic of madness. Why MAD actually made sense to understand how mutually assured destruction worked. You have to go back to the late 1950s and early 1960s. The nuclear arms race was in full swing. The United States had been the sole nuclear power for 4 years after Hiroshima, but in 1949 the Soviets detonated their first atomic bomb. The monopoly was over. By 1953 the US had 1,169 nuclear warheads. The Soviets had 120. Initially, American strategy was based on something called massive retaliation. The idea was simple and terrifying. If the Soviets attack us, or our allies in Europe with conventional forces, we nuke them into oblivion. Total. Overwhelming. And a nuclear response. It was the geopolitical equivalent of bringing a flamethrower to a fistfight. But by the early 1960s, this strategy had a fatal flaw. The Soviets now had their own massive nuclear arsenal. They had intercontinental ballistic missiles that could reach American cities. They had submarine-launched ballistic missiles lurking beneath the oceans. If the US launched a first strike, the Soviets could absolutely retaliate before they were completely destroyed. Both sides could obliterate each other. This created a paradox. Enter Robert McNamara, US Secretary of Defense under Kennedy and Johnson. McNamara, a former Ford Motor Company executive who loved spreadsheets and probability calculations, came up with a doctrine that would define the nuclear age. In 1965, he stated that assured destruction could be achieved with as few as 400 high-yield nuclear weapons targeting Soviet population centers. These weapons would be sufficient to destroy over 1/3 of the Soviet population and 1/2 of Soviet industry. Think about that for a moment. 400 warheads, not 40,000. Just 400 properly placed weapons could functionally end Soviet civilization, and the Soviets had the same calculation about the United States. This meant that even if one side launched a devastating first strike and destroyed 90% of the enemy's nuclear forces, that remaining 10% could still deliver apocalyptic retaliation. This is the core of MAD. You cannot win a nuclear war because winning means you also die. The guarantee of mutual annihilation would serve as an effective deterrent. Nobody pushes the button, because pushing the button means national suicide. It's insane. It's terrifying. And it worked. Critics hated it. Military analyst Donald Brennan, who actually coined the derisive acronym AD, argued that attempting to preserve an indefinite stalemate did little to secure US defense interests in the long term. He advocated for anti-ballistic missile defense systems that could shoot down incoming Soviet warheads. Break the stalemate. achieve superiority. But here's the problem. If you build a shield, the other side builds more swords. An arms race to pierce the shield, which is exactly what happened. 2. October 1962, when MAD was put to the test. The Cuban Missile Crisis is the single best case study of MAD in action, and it's terrifying precisely because of how close we came to the logic failing. In July 1962, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev made a secret deal with Cuban leader Fidel Castro to place nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles from the Florida coast. Khrushchev's motivations were complex. The Soviets felt uneasy about American nuclear weapons stationed in Turkey and Western Europe, all pointed at Moscow. Placing missiles in Cuba would level the playing field. It would also protect Cuba from another American invasion attempt after the failed Bay of Pigs operation in 1961. On October 14, 1962, an American U-2 spy plane captured photographic evidence of Soviet medium-range and intermediate-range ballistic nuclear missile sites under construction in Cuba. These missiles could strike most major U.S. cities in less than 5 minutes. Kennedy was briefed on October 16th. He immediately convened a group of advisors known as the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, or EXCOM. The debate was brutal. Some advisors, including all the Joint Chiefs of Staff, argued for immediate airstrikes to destroy the missile sites, followed by a full-scale invasion of Cuba. Others favored stern diplomatic warnings. Kennedy chose a middle course. On October 22nd, he announced a naval quarantine of Cuba to prevent further Soviet shipments of missiles. He demanded that the Soviets remove the existing missiles and dismantle the sites. For 13 days, the world teetered on the edge. Soviet ships were steaming toward the quarantine line. American forces were at DEFCON 2, the highest alert short of nuclear war. The Soviets had already delivered nuclear warheads to Cuba on October 4th. These warheads were never detected by U.S. intelligence while they were on the island. If Kennedy had ordered an invasion, American troops would have faced tactical nuclear weapons. On October 26th, Khrushchev sent Kennedy a long, emotional message that raised the specter of nuclear holocaust. He said, "If there is no intention to doom the world to the catastrophe of thermonuclear war, then let us not only relax the forces pulling on the ends of the rope, let us take measures to untie that knot." The next day, a second letter arrived with tougher terms, demanding that the US remove its Jupiter missiles from Turkey. Kennedy's team decided to accept the terms of the first message and ignore the second entirely. Privately, however, Attorney General Robert Kennedy delivered a message to Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin. The US would remove the Jupiter missiles from Turkey, but this could not be part of any public resolution. It was a face-saving compromise. On October 28th, Khrushchev capitulated. He announced that Soviet missiles would be dismantled and removed from Cuba. The crisis was over, but it left both superpowers shaken. They had stared into the abyss. The logic of MAD had held, but barely. Kennedy had been told in early 1961 that a nuclear war would probably kill a third of humanity. Khrushchev likely received a similar estimate. That knowledge informed every decision they made during those 13 days. MAD worked because both leaders understood the stakes, but it required rational actors. And that's a terrifying dependency. If you think this is dramatic, just wait. In the next section, we're going to look at the insane scale of the nuclear arms race and how both sides spent decades building enough weapons to destroy Earth multiple times over. If you want to understand the Cold War without the boring textbook jargon, smash that subscribe button. And let me know in the comments, do you think MAD is still relevant today? Or are we facing new nuclear threats that it can't address? I read every comment. 3. The arms race. Nobody could stop. Here's the dark irony of mutually assured destruction. The strategy designed to prevent nuclear war actually accelerated the nuclear arms race. If your security depends on being able to destroy the enemy even after they destroy you, you need a lot of weapons. And you need them to survive a first strike. This led to the most wasteful, terrifying, and frankly insane military build-up in human history. Let's look at the numbers. Between 1945 and 2013, more than 125,000 nuclear warheads were built. 53% belonged to the United States, 44% to the Soviet Union and Russia. The remaining 3% were divided among the United Kingdom, France, China, Israel, India, Pakistan, and North Korea. Over 125,000 weapons designed to vaporize cities, poison the atmosphere with radiation, and potentially trigger nuclear winter. The US nuclear stockpile peaked in 1967 at 32,255 warheads. The Soviet stockpile peaked in 1986 at over 40,000 warheads. At the height of the arms race in the mid-1980s, the combined US-Soviet arsenal exceeded 60,000 nuclear weapons. The total explosive yield of the US arsenal in 1960 was 20,491 megatons. That's equivalent to 1.4 million Hiroshima bombs. Why so many? Because MAD required second strike capability. You needed enough weapons dispersed across enough platforms that no first strike could eliminate your ability to retaliate. This led to the nuclear triad: land-based intercontinental ballistic missiles in hardened silos, submarine-launched ballistic missiles on nuclear-powered subs hidden in the ocean, and strategic bombers that could be scrambled at a moment's notice. The Soviets developed the Dead Hand system, an automated doomsday device designed to ensure retaliation even if the entire Soviet command structure was destroyed in a first strike. If sensors detected nuclear detonations on Soviet soil and couldn't establish contact with leadership, the system would automatically launch a massive retaliatory strike. It was the ultimate commitment to MAD. Even if you kill us, we kill you. Automatic. Irreversible. The Americans had their own version. Strategic Air Command maintained 1/3 of its bomber force on constant alert during the Cold War. Pilots lived in ready rooms, crews slept in shifts. At any moment, nuclear-armed B-52 stratofortresses could be airborne in minutes. The entire system was designed around one principle: you cannot disarm us. This created a paradox. Both sides knew that nuclear war was unwinnable, but both sides kept building more weapons. Why? Because the logic of MAD meant that any technological advantage, any gap in capability, could theoretically undermine deterrence. If the Soviets developed a more accurate missile, the US had to match it. If the Americans deployed multiple independently targetable re-entry vehicles, or MRVs, allowing a single missile to carry up to 14 nuclear warheads, the Soviets had to do the same. You cannot make this stuff up. The strategy meant to prevent war became a machine that consumed billions of dollars and produced tens of thousands of world-ending weapons. And the craziest part? It worked. And for all its insanity, the arms race never went hot. 4. September 26, 1983. The man who saved the world. If the Cuban Missile Crisis was MAD's first major test, September 26, 1983 was its most terrifying near-miss. And the reason we're all still here comes down to one Soviet officer who trusted his gut over his computer. Meet Stanislav Petrov. On the night of September 26, 1983, Lieutenant Colonel Petrov was on duty at Serpukhov 15, a secret bunker outside Moscow that housed the command center for the Soviet early warning satellite system, codenamed OKO. Petrov's job was to monitor the satellite network and notify his superiors of any impending nuclear missile attack. If an attack was detected, Soviet doctrine called for an immediate and compulsory nuclear counterattack, launch on warning, mutually assured destruction. Shortly after midnight, the bunker's computers reported that one intercontinental ballistic missile was heading toward the Soviet Union from the United States. Then 4 more. 5 American ICBMs inbound. The system declared high reliability. The screen flashed red with the word launch. Launch. This wasn't a warning. This wasn't a warning. It was an automatic order to prepare for retaliation. Here's the context that makes this moment even more terrifying. 1983 was perhaps the most dangerous year of the entire Cold War. In March, President Ronald Reagan had delivered his famous Evil Empire speech, calling the Soviet Union the focus of evil in the modern world. Later that month, Reagan announced the Strategic Defense Initiative, a program to build space-based weapons that could shoot down incoming Soviet missiles. The Soviets saw this as an attempt to break MAD by achieving first strike capability. On September 1st, just 3 weeks before Petrov's shift, the Soviet military had shot down Korean Airlines Flight 007 after it strayed into Soviet airspace. All 269 people aboard were killed, including a US congressman. Reagan called it a massacre. US-Soviet relations had deteriorated to the point where the Soviet Union as a system was geared to expect an attack and retaliate very quickly. It was on hair-trigger alert. It was very nervous and prone to mistakes and accidents. So when those alarms went off, Petrov had every reason to believe it was real. But something didn't add up. He had been trained that a US nuclear attack would involve hundreds of missiles, not 5. A massive first strike designed to overwhelm Soviet defenses and destroy their retaliatory capability. 5 missiles made no strategic sense. Additionally, ground-based radar installations showed no evidence of an attack. The satellite system was new and had been questioned for reliability in the past. Petrov made a decision. He called his commanders and reported the alert as a false alarm. He was not certain. He later said, "I was never sure that the alarm was erroneous." But he trusted his instincts over the machine. And he was right. No missiles arrived. The false alarm was eventually traced to the Cosmos 1382 satellite, which had picked up the sun's reflection off the tops of clouds and mistook it for missile launches. Petrov's decision is widely believed to have prevented a catastrophic Soviet retaliation. If he had reported the attack as valid, his superiors might have launched an assault against the United States, precipitating a full-scale nuclear war. The logic of MAD had held, but only because one man chose not to follow protocol. Think about that. The survival of civilization depended on a Soviet officer second-guessing his computer at 2 in the morning. And the truly insane part, Petrov was never rewarded for this decision. According to him, the incident embarrassed his superiors and the scientist responsible for the missile detection system. If he had been officially rewarded, they would have had to be punished. He was reassigned to a less sensitive post, took early retirement, and suffered a nervous breakdown. Petrov died in 2017 at age 77. For years, almost no one knew what he had done. 5. Arms control, the strategy within the strategy. The nuclear close calls of 1962 and 1983 made one thing clear: leaving MAD entirely to chance was suicidal. Both superpowers needed mechanisms to stabilize the balance of terror. This led to the second part of the Cold War nuclear strategy that actually worked: arms control treaties. The first major breakthrough came with the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, or SALT. Negotiations began in Helsinki in November 1969 and continued for 2.5 years. The result was SALT I, signed by President Richard Nixon and Soviet General Secretary Leonid Brezhnev in Moscow on May 26, 1972. For the first time during the Cold War, the United States and Soviet Union agreed to limit the number of nuclear missiles in their arsenals. SALT I included 2 key components. First, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, which limited each side to only 2 ABM deployment sites and 200 interceptor missiles total, later reduced to 1 site and 100 interceptors. The logic was brilliant. If you can't defend yourself, you won't be tempted to strike first. MAD stays intact. Second, an interim agreement froze the number of intercontinental ballistic missiles and submarine-launched ballistic missiles at current levels for 5 years. SALT II followed in 1979, limiting both nations' nuclear forces to 2,250 delivery vehicles and placing restrictions on MVREs and other strategic systems. Although the US Senate never ratified SALT II due to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in December 1979, both countries pledged to adhere to the agreement's terms. They largely did. Then came the 1987 Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, or INF. Signed by Reagan and Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev, the INF Treaty required both countries to eliminate all ground-launched missiles with a range of 500 to 5,500 kilometers. It was the first treaty to eliminate an entire class of nuclear weapons. In total, 2,692 missiles were eliminated. The treaty led directly to START I, the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, signed in 1991. START I was massive. It required the US and Soviet Union to reduce their deployed strategic arsenals to 1,600 delivery vehicles carrying no more than 6,000 warheads. The agreement required the destruction of excess delivery vehicles, verified through intrusive on-site inspections, regular data exchange, and satellite monitoring. For the first time, nuclear warheads were actually being dismantled, not just stockpiled. The result? From a combined peak of over 60,000 warheads in the mid-1980s, the US and Russian stockpiles dropped to about 15,000 by the early 2000s. Today, the US maintains roughly 5,550 total warheads, with about 1,670 actively deployed. Russia has approximately 6,257 total warheads, with 1,718 deployed. That's still enough to destroy civilization, but it's an 80% reduction from the Cold War peak. Here's the critical insight. These treaties didn't replace MAD. They reinforced it. By limiting defensive systems and capping offensive arsenals, the treaties ensured that both sides remained vulnerable to retaliation. Nobody could win. Nobody could escape destruction. The balance of terror remained stable. And that stability, as insane as it sounds, kept the peace. 6. The unsung heroes of deterrence. Petrov wasn't the only person who prevented nuclear war through individual judgment. Throughout the Cold War, there were countless moments when the system teetered on the edge, and someone chose restraint over retaliation. Just 11 days after Petrov's false alarm, NATO conducted a military exercise called Able Archer 83. The exercise simulated NATO's response to a hypothetical Soviet nuclear attack. Unlike previous wargames, Able Archer featured new elements specifically designed to test procedures in realistic conditions. The Soviets, already paranoid after the Korean airliner incident and Reagan's aggressive rhetoric, believed the exercise might be a cover for an actual NATO-first strike. KGB observers alerted Moscow of unusual activity. Soviet leader Yuri Andropov mobilized entire military divisions, transported nuclear weapons to launch sites, and scrambled a fleet of bombers carrying nuclear warheads. Military command handed Andropov the nuclear briefcase, known in Russia as the Chekit. The Soviets were preparing for war. On the American side, Leonard Perutz, a high-ranking intelligence officer for the US Air Force stationed in Europe, observed that the Soviets were responding as though the exercise was real. In what has been called a fortuitous, if ill-informed decision, Perutz did not reciprocate by raising Western asset alert levels. He waited. The Soviets eventually realized the exercise was not a surprise attack and aborted their planned response. These moments reveal a critical truth about MAD. It only works with human beings in the loop. Automated systems, hair-trigger alerts, and launch-on-warning doctrines brought the world to the brink multiple times. What saved us wasn't the logic of deterrence. It was individuals like Petrov and Perutz choosing to question the data, to wait for confirmation, to risk their careers rather than risk Armageddon. General George Butler, who took over the US Strategic Air Command in 1991, once said, "We escaped the Cold War without a nuclear holocaust by some combination of skill, luck, and divine intervention, and I suspect the latter in greatest proportion." That's not reassuring. That's terrifying. The strategy that worked relied on luck as much as logic. 7. The end of the Cold War. Victory without war. When the Berlin Wall fell in November 1989 and the Soviet Union dissolved in December 1991, MAD had achieved something no one thought possible. It ended the Cold War without a shot fired between the superpowers. No invasion of Western Europe. No nuclear exchange. No World War III. The collapse of the Soviet Union created a unique window for arms reduction. With the existential threat gone, both sides rapidly drew down their arsenals. The US helped Russia dismantle thousands of warheads through programs like the Nun-Luga Cooperative Threat Reduction Initiative. Former Soviet republics Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and Belarus gave up their nuclear weapons in exchange for security guarantees and economic assistance. By the mid-1990s, the global nuclear stockpile had shrunk dramatically. The New START Treaty, which entered into force in 2011, further limited both the US and Russia to 1,550 deployed strategic warheads. For the first time since the dawn of the nuclear age, the trajectory was toward fewer weapons, not more. But here's the thing nobody wants to talk about. MAD never really ended. Russia still has thousands of nuclear warheads. So does the United States. Both maintain the nuclear triad. Both have modernization programs underway. The logic of mutually assured destruction still underpins the relationship between nuclear powers today. And new threats have emerged that MAD was never designed to handle. North Korea has nuclear weapons and demonstrates them regularly. The regime's apparent indifference to citizen welfare challenges. MAD's assumption of rational self-interest. Pakistan and India both have nuclear arsenals, creating the possibility of asymmetric MAD in South Asia. China is expanding its nuclear forces. Iran's nuclear ambitions remain unresolved. Perhaps most concerning, new technologies threaten to undermine the foundations of MRD. Cyber attacks on nuclear command and control systems could disable retaliation capabilities without triggering automatic responses. Hypersonic missiles traveling at 5 times the speed of sound could evade detection and reach targets in minutes. Anti-satellite weapons could blind early warning systems. These developments could create first-strike opportunities that MAD was designed to eliminate. 8. Unbay. Mad in 2026. Does it still work? So here we are in 2026, more than 70 years after the dawn of the nuclear age. Is mutually assured destruction still the strategy that keeps us safe? The answer is complicated. On one hand, the core logic remains intact. The United States and Russia still cannot attack each other without facing existential retaliation. The nuclear triad ensures survivability. Even a devastating first strike would leave enough weapons intact for a catastrophic counterstrike. The balance of terror persists. But the geopolitical landscape has changed dramatically. We no longer live in a bipolar world with two superpowers. China is a rising nuclear power. Regional conflicts in South Asia and the Middle East involve nuclear-armed states. The risk of nuclear terrorism, while still low, is non-zero. Non-state actors represent a challenge to MAD because they lack territory to retaliate against, and may welcome martyrdom. The arms control architecture that stabilized MAD during the Cold War is also fraying. The United States withdrew from the ABM Treaty in 2002 and the INF Treaty in 2019. Russia suspended participation in New START in 2023. The treaty expires in February 2026, with no replacement currently negotiated. Without these agreements, the nuclear arms race could accelerate once again. There's also the problem of accidents and miscalculations. We know from 1962 and 1983 that close calls happen. As nuclear forces age and new technologies are introduced, the risk of technical failures or false alarms increases. Modern systems are more complex than ever. More sensors, more automation, more potential points of failure. Every time we add a layer of technology, we add a potential pathway to catastrophe. Yet for all these challenges, MAD remains the foundation of nuclear deterrence. No nation has used nuclear weapons in war since 1945. That's 80 years without a nuclear detonation in anger. For all its flaws, for all its terrifying dependence on rational actors and functioning systems, MAD has delivered an outcome no one in 1945 would have predicted: a long peace between nuclear powers. Final thoughts. So what do we make of mutually assured destruction? Is it a triumph of strategic thinking, or the most dangerous gamble in human history? The answer is both. MAD worked because it aligned incentives in a perverse but effective way. Neither side could gain from starting a nuclear war. The costs of aggression exceeded any conceivable benefit. This created stability, albeit a terrifying stability built on the threat of annihilation. It wasn't beautiful. It wasn't moral. But it was effective. The lesson of the Cold War is that deterrence requires more than just weapons. It requires credible communication, arms control agreements, and human judgment in the loop. The treaties mattered. The treaties mattered. The hotline between Washington and Moscow mattered. The individual decisions of people like Stanislav Petrov and Leonid Perutz mattered. MAD was never just a doctrine. It was a system that had to be actively managed. But relying on this system indefinitely is like playing Russian roulette with the survival of civilization. Eventually, luck runs out. A technical malfunction occurs at the worst possible moment. A leader makes an irrational decision in a crisis. A new technology breaks the balance of terror. The math is relentless. Every year we maintain thousands of nuclear weapons on high alert. Is another year we roll the dice. The question for our generation is whether we can move beyond MAD without losing its core benefit: peace between nuclear powers. Can we reduce arsenals further without creating instability? Can we develop new arms control frameworks that address modern threats like cyber warfare and hypersonic weapons? Can we create international norms that make nuclear use unthinkable? I don't have easy answers. But I do know this: the Cold War nuclear strategy that actually worked was the one that prevented us from destroying ourselves. That's a low bar. But given the stakes, clearing that bar for 80 years is a remarkable achievement. If you want to understand the biggest threats facing humanity in the 21st century, you need to watch our upcoming video on the new nuclear age and how modern technologies are undermining deterrence. It makes this situation look like a walk in the park. And if you learned something today, if this video made you think differently about nuclear weapons and deterrence, hit that like button. It helps the algorithm more than a government subsidy. See you in the next one.